We are unique because we are in a very advanced stage of the technology development that should be in the end of this year and beginning of next year tested in Houston by our partners Wells, and we are closest to the commercial availability of the drilling technology. Cheap, fast and efficient drilling is the key to unlock the deep reservoirs, and that's where we are. I'm coming from technology. We are connecting worlds of the really high tech and let's say strong engineering, electrical, mechanical engineering, science, physics background with the drilling industry to match these two worlds with a big disruption. And this was why we were also excited by that, because we clearly recognize visiting many places like Iceland where geothermal works. And our biggest question was why we should not copy paste this situation when you can have very effective, cheap baseload energy in the way that we can utilize it where you need it. And for us, the clear answer was once we are able to develop and commercialize the system that is able to significantly decrease the cost of geothermal, it could happen anywhere. So that was our clear vision since beginning. We are very motivated to go through all obstacles that were, and now combining our efforts with the existing drilling industry that has a lot of experience with the drilling, we are slowly reaching the target. And what I think the mentioned oil and gas drilling industry can help to geo drilling, but also to geothermal in general, is that first, without this industry, I think never happened geothermal scale, because all the trained people, talent, many tens of the years practical experience lies within the oil and gas industry, and therefore utilizing these resources is absolutely vital for the success. And last but not least, I think is an ideal way how the oil and gas industry can open the big renewable market that will be treated by public, by shareholders, by whoever, as a positive step to open the new business line that maybe in 10-20 years can significantly replace the current activities that will be maybe not more so much expected from the companies.
Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Michael Campos. I'm with Azolla Ventures, a venture capital firm investing in breakthrough climate technology companies. We're backed in part by philanthropic dollars, and we seek to address capital gaps for startups that could go on to become the pillars of a future low-carbon economy. First, I want to give a big thanks to the Pivot organizers and production crew for putting on a top-notch event. Please help me show them some love with reactions at the bottom of your screen, and please don't be shy about hitting that reaction button throughout. So at Azolla, we invest in emissions reductions broadly, but over the past couple of years, I've had the privilege to work on geothermal funding specifically. First, at the U.S. Department of Energy's Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, or ARPA-E, and then more recently as a VC, where last year we made our first geothermal investment in a company called Zanskar, which does predictive exploration. So with me today, we have a world-class group of panelists. I'll get to their introductions in a minute, but to state who they are first, we have Tom Kalil, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at Schmidt Futures, Jamie Beard, who's the Executive Director of Project InnerSpace and our fearless leader here at Pivot. We have Drew Nelson, who's a Senior Program Officer at the Catena Foundation, and we have Marc von Keitz, Director at the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment. So I want to open by painting a picture of the continuum of philanthropic funding sources. So this panel covers philanthropy and geothermal, which are two words you don't often hear used together, but they're part of this really wide world of funding across types of efforts, ranging from technology, policy, community or place-based work, education, and other things. Different types of giving, ranging from grants to recoverable grants to program-related investments and mission-related investments. And then across the types of organizations giving and receiving dollars from individuals, family offices, foundations, companies, and governments. And so the picture here is of a less constrained funding source than is typical of government grants or investment capital. In some ways, it's pretty perfect for addressing capital gaps. But it's also a shockingly deep pool of capital. We don't often think of it this way, but philanthropy is almost an entire asset class in its own right. According to the ClimateWorks Foundation, total philanthropic giving was about $750 billion per year in 2020. 750 billion, that's a lot, with a B. That's equal to the value of Meta, formerly Facebook, plus Netflix, and then plus another 2 Netflixes every year. Or put another way, venture capital, the thing that I do, had its biggest year ever last year by a factor of 2, and it invested $330 billion, which is still less than half of the amount of philanthropic giving in a normal year. This is big. So there are, of course, many worthy causes that philanthropists might support. So naturally, climate and energy are a pretty small piece of the pie. In 2020, climate philanthropy was between about 6 and 10 billion, or about 1% of the total. And we're here to talk about geothermal, of course. And let's just say that, in the grand scheme, it's a small piece of a small piece currently. But each of the 5 of us here has an interest in changing that. Each of us here believes in our own way that there's innovation to be unleashed through creative philanthropic funding. So in the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to explore that. And at this point, I want to turn it over to our panelists to give introductions to themselves. If each of you could do a 1-minute introduction and then a brief statement about how you've intersected with geothermal so far, that would be great. Let's start with Tom, and go to Jamie, and then Drew, and then a wrap with Marc. From there, we'll go into prepared questions. Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. As Michael said, my name is Tom Kalil. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Schmidt Futures, which is a philanthropic initiative supported by Eric and Wendy Schmidt. And so we're interested, obviously, in geothermal as a component of our overall climate portfolio, and interest in the question about whether geothermal could play a much more significant role than it currently is in terms of providing carbon neutral baseload sources of energy. So we've been active on 2 fronts: the policy front, and also investing in some of the public goods that will help advance geothermal, working closely with Jamie and her team in Project InnerSpace, looking at issues like techno-economic analysis and providing open data that would be useful for resource characterization for geothermal.
Awesome, thanks, Tom. So I'm next. I'm Jamie Beard. So my journey into philanthropy and philanthropic funding is pretty new. And I mentioned this a little bit yesterday, but just to summarize, I started out with the Geothermal Entrepreneurship Organization, beating down the doors of capital, because we had all of these awesome geothermal startups emerging out of the oil field and out of Texas largely, who need of money to go do pre-commercial demonstration projects that were quite novel and first of a kind. And it was really hard going. VCs were saying, this is weird. We don't really know about geothermal. There's a lot of risk. That's a lot of money. What are you talking about? Your seed round is 30 million. We don't do that. So then private equity, same thing. Well, this is too high risk. Come back after you get your first one done. And it was a lot of pain. And we couldn't get teams deployed. And so, really what I ended up, what I ended up landing on is, well, how can we leverage, climate philanthropy to get some of these, these barriers to growth addressed while other entities catch up, essentially. And so that's why I launched Project InnerSpace, which is a nonprofit that is funded by climate philanthropy. And I'm working with, all the panelists on that. So, I'm here to represent the perspective of a nonprofit beneficiary, and to kind of explain how that came about. But there are others, and I'm hoping there will be many nonprofit beneficiaries that jump into geothermal, because this is an opportunity to get across some valleys of death here. Thanks, Drew. You're next.
Thanks, Jamie, and hi, everybody. My name is Drew Nelson. I'm with the Catena Foundation. We are a family foundation based out of Colorado with a focus on the Southwest plus Texas. I'm only 6 months into that job. In my previous professional life at Catena, I run the climate and clean energy program. And in my previous position, I did the same, but for a Texas-based foundation, the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. And for those of you who know of a George Mitchell, this is not the former Maine Senator George Mitchell, but the godfather of hydraulic fracturing, George Mitchell. And so, we had a pretty unique perspective on technologies and energy in the future of a more sustainable Texas, which was and continues to be the focus of the foundation is Texas. And I was looking at an article on geothermal, and it quoted this woman named Jamie Beard at the University of Texas. And I said, hey, wait a second. I'm based in Austin. The University of Texas is literally a stone's throw from our office. Why am I not talking to her? So she and I started talking, and she convinced me that there's a lot of potential for geothermal, not just in Texas, but more broadly. And the way that I've been kind of thinking about it is, if I had $1 for every time over my career on climate change I've heard that there's no such thing as a silver bullet in the climate space, I'd have enough money to fund whatever I wanted to fund. But I think geothermal can be as close to a silver bullet as we can get. It's clean, it's base load, it's using an existing industry that has technical know-how, and the jobs that are in geothermal are very easily transferable from existing industries like the oil and gas sector. So for a state like Texas that has had some issues with energy reliability and has some questions about where that job force is going to go, there's a lot of potential for geothermal. And so in my previous position, I worked with Jamie to map out what that could look like for Texas. And I look forward to talking about that here in the next little bit. And over to you, Marc.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And particularly thank you to Jamie and to Michael for organizing this panel. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm Marc von Keitz. I'm with the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment, which was started nearly 25 years ago by Jeremy Grantham and his wife, Hannelore. And as the name implies, focused on the environment, but for the last 15 years, really the emphasis has been on climate change and what we can do to slow it down. And we are getting engaged in this field, both on the side of grants, trying to support the ecosystem, but we have a particular interest in driving forward technologies. And we are using an investment vehicle that we call neglected climate opportunities. And so we really are looking for the things that haven't gotten the attention that we think they deserve based on their potential. And I think geothermal clearly falls into that category. Our main emphasis has been for the last few years carbon dioxide removal. And one of the areas that has led us to is actually looking a lot more at the subsurface in various forms of mineralization, CO2 sequestration. And it has, I think, stirred a growing interest that we are not paying enough attention to the subsurface for all the different parts of the climate challenges that we have ahead. And so we feel that, well, we have made actual investments in this space with Zanskar that Michael already mentioned, but we are also looking to support this field. We have made some investment, like a grant funding to University of Texas to look at the intersection between geothermal and carbon sequestration, for example. And then we are really looking at how can we bring all these different pieces together. So it's like CO2 sequestration, geothermal, in parts even critical minerals. And so I think it's a tremendous area that is, at the same time, as Drew already said, there's such a well-trained workforce that can bring skills to this that we can ramp to scale probably much faster than many other solutions. And I think ultimately for us, it's not just a question of cost and scale, but also speed to scale. And I think that's where geothermal offers tremendous opportunities. So looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you all. Marc, I want to actually start with you to dive just a little bit deeper into what you said about geothermal and carbon removal. So what from a technical sense, what is exciting to you about that intersection? Is it that you can bring the heat to the surface to drive carbon removal or direct air capture processes? Is it that you have these naturally occurring formations that are particularly good in the subsurface for carbon removal? Is it a combination of both? And then what sorts of things, to bring it to Grantham, what sorts of things have you all funded related to that?
So first of all, we're still in the early stages. So we are still trying to figure out what are the best ways to deploy our resources to have a truly catalytic impact, because we recognize that what we bring to the table in total quantity of money is maybe not that much, but because we have a high risk tolerance, we may be able to unleash more capital that by us making an early commitment. That's how we have operated across a lot of our investments. But with regard to the intersection between climate and geothermal, I think what really brought me to the forefront of geothermal is that if you look at a lot of the decarbonization technologies, there's a very heavy reliance on renewable electricity. And so at the same time, what I'm particularly interested in is diversification of energy sources that we can bring to the table. And I think geothermal is really truly additive. It's like, it's not just another technology that relies on wind and solar, but it really brings new megawatt hours to the table that diversify and ultimately stabilize the system. At the same time, when you start drilling and looking at various geologies, you are having the opportunity to more potentially completely utilize that subsurface, use this well that you drill for many other things as well. And so that's, I think, because we all recognize that drilling is one of the most expensive parts. So the more uses you get out of a well, the better.
Wonderful. So I have a more general question. I want to get some discussion going on. So I think we are all here interested in getting geothermal projects into the ground, but there's a lot of risk in going first with any new type of infrastructure. And so I would put this question to Jamie to start, but I'd love to hear everybody else's thoughts as well. How do you think philanthropic capital can be used specifically in project finance?
Yeah, so that whole, hearing over and over again, yeah, well, we don't fund that, right? That was probably it's been one of the most frustrating aspects of the last couple of years for me. When there's a pile of entrepreneurs and teams on the sidelines and everybody is screaming globally, we have to go, let's go fast, right? And there are people ready to deploy. And there's not the right funding mechanism to get them into the field. And really the pain point here is first of a kind projects. Michael, you all know about that. You just published a report about that. It's a panel topic later today that I would encourage folks to tune into because it's a problem. We have a situation in energy and in particular, capital intensive first of a kind projects. And really in terms of geothermal startups, this is really unique because you have people coming out of oil and gas with 30 or 40 years of operational expertise. You've got teams with 200 or 300 years combined of operational expertise, and they go from 0 to 60 in a matter of months. So they go from no money to needing $50 million in months, right? And that doesn't fit. That's a really unique problem. And so I landed in philanthropy after trying everything else and realizing there wasn't a comfortable current funding mechanism. And I mean anywhere, not even loan programs office, right? So people would say, well, just go to the government. This is a situation, the reason we're stuck, everyone's saying the same thing, which is, well, it's not a good fit for this reason, that reason, or another, right? And so if we want to go fast, somebody's got to fund it, right? So let's go. And the quickest and easiest way I was able to reason is starting a nonprofit. And nonprofits are interesting because we work with folks like on this panel, so the larger philanthropy. But we also get donations of $5 a month from average citizens, right? So you can actually cast a wide net and engage the world in philanthropy. And that's a deep, big pool of funding that can be then leveraged and directed toward where the need is, which is right to do these big projects to, to address pain points. And then eventually, eventually other types of funding up, right? But right now, if we want to go, we got to figure out how to do it. So that's been my experience over the last year.
I would love to bring in the funder perspective. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about an approach that I've been very interested in and that Schmidt Futures has begun to make some preliminary investments in. And that is looking at the role that what economists either call demand pull, as opposed to technology push approaches, and market shaping. And essentially, you are trying to affect the demand for an innovation, as opposed to increasing the supply of innovation by funding research and development, the way you would have done when you were at ARPA-E with a FOA. So just some historical examples of this: the highly successful collaboration between NASA and SpaceX. NASA said to SpaceX, "We want a rocket that will go up to the International Space Station, deliver and retrieve cargo, and ultimately crew. And not only will we buy rides on the rocket once you make it, but we will also provide you with milestone payments for intermediate progress towards that goal." Operation Warp Speed. The government said to Pfizer, "If you get an emergency use authorization from the FDA, we commit upfront that we will buy 300 million doses of that vaccine." That was hugely successful. We supported the work of Susan Athey as a Schmidt Futures Innovation Fellow. She worked with Stripe, Meta, Alphabet, Shopify, and McKinsey to design a $925 million advanced market commitment for carbon removal called Frontier Climate. We're supporting the work of the Mission Possible Partnership, and they have been working to form these buyers clubs, that is, coalitions, usually of large enterprises, who are willing to be the buyer of first resort in those areas where we need to make the transition to a low carbon economy, like cement and steel and shipping. So I'm really interested in the role that these demand pull approaches could play in, getting geothermal. Drew mentioned, George Mitchell. What is the fracking moment for geothermal, and what role could these demand pull approaches play in that, in addressing this first of a kind, green premium issue? The role of foundations and philanthropists is to address market failures. So if there's an investment opportunity and a VC or a bank or private equity will write a check, then that is not a good place for the allocation of scarce philanthropic dollars. The market failure that you have with these first of a kind projects is that there is learning by doing that goes on that is not captured by the individual firm. The broader market failure that we have is there is no economy-wide price on carbon. And so those are two examples of market failures that philanthropy can and should be involved in addressing.
Drew, are there any other market failures or opportunities for philanthropic dollars that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, I'd like to kind of build on what was just said and take it another couple of steps. At both of the foundations that I've been at, we haven't really done the project investment, although we've made a couple program-related investments, but that's a different rabbit hole we don't need to go down right now. And instead, what we've been focused on is how do you drive the markets? How do you make people aware of the opportunity and see where some of the hurdles for adoption are and try to overcome those hurdles? And I think that's undertaken in a number of different ways. It depends on the foundation and it depends on the priorities, but a lot of foundations fund academic research, not kind of lab research about what's the next technological breakthrough, but research about, well, how do you decarbonize an economy? What does that modeling look like? And there's a lot of foundations that then fund advocates to say, okay, well, here's what we think is needed. And going to talk to their local or their state or their national representatives to say, hey, let's get moving on this. And, you know, I think a really clear example of that is what happened last night with the news that I think most of us saw, that what is it, the new acronym, the Inflation Reduction Act looks to be in a place where it could actually move forward, which will be transformative to a lot of clean technologies in the US in a number of different categories, including geothermal. And, you know, that didn't happen by accident. That happened because companies and advocates worked tirelessly over the last years to move something along those lines forward. In a much smaller scale, and I'll wrap up here relatively quick, when I was at the Mitchell Foundation, after talking with Jamie, we came to the conclusion that we don't know what the opportunity is in Texas for geothermal, and unlocking those new innovations that Mr. Mitchell helped bring to the oil and gas industry of directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing and pulling those things together. What would that mean for the geothermal industry in the state? You know, when people think of geothermal, Hawaii, Iceland, California, Texas isn't really on that list. And so we funded the University of Texas to do a study, which hopefully will be coming out relatively soon, that looks at the potential for geothermal in Texas and what are the costs for that. And the hypothesis, which I think the final study will be on track to prove, is that it's actually hotter, more shallow in Texas, which means that it's going to be cheaper to drill for geothermal than people previously thought. But the study wasn't just that. It was also, what are the environmental issues that people need to be considering? Let's get ahead of this, unlike what happened with hydraulic fracturing. What is the potential benefit for industry of doing on-site heat generation? What are some of the potential linkages with carbon dioxide removal? And, you know, like what Marc said, I think there's a lot of really interesting cost savings that can take place there. And finally, what are the policy solutions that Texas could start to move forward to ramp up this industry and ensure that Texas maintains its role as an energy leader? And then the second thing that we did was we then worked with a group of people to start the Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance, so that when the report came out, there was an industry association ready to go to take those policy recommendations and try to get them put into law. And, you know, to Thomas's point, one of the things that they're currently actively looking at is in Texas law, and we, you know, Texas has all sorts of weird things going on in its energy markets. But when we created our energy only market, there was a carve out for non-wind renewables, where the utilities, or the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, could ask utilities and generators to put in these renewables and charge a little bit more for it, but to stimulate the adoption of those technologies. And so the TexGEA is currently looking at, is it possible to use that non-wind carve out to incentivize production of geothermal in the state? And that's something that we're pretty excited about. So thank you.
Michael, can I follow what Drew just said for a second? So you all, if you tuned in the last couple of days to Pivot, you'll see some of the echoes of this work in panel sessions. So, and all these things can, you know, you can start seeing relationships and how they all relate and build on one another. The Future of Geothermal in Texas report, awesome, started with a grant from the Mitchell Foundation, with two other funders. You know, multi-entity, cross-entity, more than 20 authors, coming in peer review now. But in earlier sessions in Pivot, you saw Rebecca Schultz leading sessions about, you know, the new techno-economic analysis for geothermal and the Texas Geothermal report preview session. those were previews of that work. And now what InnerSpace is doing is actually taking that work further with the support of Schmidt Futures into a broader, more global approach to techno-economics in geothermal, wrapping in learnings and scale from the oil and gas industry, right? So all of these projects build on one another with the support from multiple entities, and none of it would have happened or been possible without philanthropic organizations stepping up and saying, hey, this is interesting. What can we fund that is aligned with our mission and what we usually fund? And so, there are a lot of opportunities to build momentum that way.
Drew, you mentioned a couple of interesting things and recent developments in the policy front. I want to stay on that thread for a moment. So Tom, you worked for 2 presidents over about 16 years. How do you think the geothermal sector, whether it's for-profits or nonprofits, should be interacting with policymakers?
Yeah, so I think that geothermal currently does not get enough attention from policymakers. So I think one thing is just education and convincing them that geothermal could be making a much larger contribution to baseload carbon neutral energy generation, number one. And then number two, having a prioritized set of things that the federal government and the state government can do that would really move the needle. So I talked about demand pull, market shaping interventions. Jamie has written eloquently about the need for a much broader range of demonstration projects as a way of getting, kind of rapid incremental improvements in geothermal, particularly on the drilling side. Eli Dorado has talked about the importance of addressing permitting issues. So clearly, right now, the oil and gas industry has what is called a categorical exemption. So we're in the sort of perverse situation where the oil and gas industry has a better regulatory regime for permitting than the geothermal industry has. I think that's something that should change. So it's really the ability to identify concretely what is it that you want the federal government and state governments to consider doing that they're not doing, and making the case for that, and engaging a broader range of stakeholders. So I think that the geothermal industry would be much better off if they just weren't seen as advancing their own kind of narrow self-serving agenda, but environmental NGOs like the Environmental Defense Fund were talking about the need to make these investments.
Great. I want to shift gears a little bit and flip to the perspective of somebody seeking funding. And this panel, I'm sure, has a lot to say on that topic. So outside of a handful of major foundations, just in philanthropy generally, it can be hard to know where to look or how to navigate a space. How would you recommend people seeking philanthropic dollars get the attention of a foundation or an individual or a family office or whatever it is? Maybe let's start with Marc. I think you may have some interesting things to say on this at Grantham.
Yeah, so first on, when people visit our website, one of the things they usually see that we are not really asked, like, we don't have typically broad calls, and we don't say it's like just send us everything. So we need to typically find a way of engaging in a conversation. Oftentimes we are engaged with a number of forums. We're pretty well plugged into various industries. For example, in the case of geothermal, I think Jamie is a really, really critical conduit for us to filter this, because we have just very limited time. And so we need to make sure that we are not spinning our wheels too much. But overall, if we get to a certain level of engagement, one of the things that I always want to hear about a project, clearly the technology, that you have something exciting and interesting, but the part that is really important to me as well is that when you are looking for funding, is what can this funding do, not just for you directly, but what can it do for the larger field? How do you bring this whole community forward? We very strongly believe in helping the evolution and development of the communities that is carrying new technologies. And so we try to use these communities. Sometimes we try to support them. And so I think conduits, clearly people can contact me directly, but it's usually not the most effective way. So it's like it's like be active in your community, and we try to be engaged with this community and then learning together, and then we can come to the point where we think about what is the best way to support either your individual projects or joint efforts.
Yeah. Relatedly, Jamie, you represent the other side of the table here. Obviously, earlier this year, you launched Project InnerSpace with the support of Schmidt. You were also named a Schmidt Innovation Fellow. At this point last year, you were focused on geo. You're supported by the Department of Energy, and before that, at a public university. So I'd be especially curious to hear your experiences being funded through philanthropy and government, and what the key differences you've seen are.
Oh boy. Oh my gosh. Well, there's a lot. And and honestly, when it comes to geothermal, it's really required to engage new entities in the concept. It's required a lot of chasing and educating and being bothersome and annoying and never going away and bothering people until they agree to talk. And, I think annoying persistence helps, particularly for entities that do not know about geothermal and that don't feel like they have the proper expertise. I think that probably applies at this point to just about everybody, unless they're on this panel. I mean, I hate to say that, but really, I think the call to action here is in terms of engaging with foundations and family offices and high net worth individuals, even governments outside of the U.S. Department of Energy. Your number one goal would be to educate first, and to get interest, and then to try to help those entities build their own strategies that are aligned with their mission. So in a lot of ways, you're starting from the ground up with entities, and this goes also for environmental NGOs. Aside from the Clean Air Task Force that have really gotten off to the ground running on geothermal over the past year and have now built an internal geothermal program, and they've showed up here at Pivot and have actually run sessions, which is awesome. But they are, they're a standalone in terms of really pushing on geothermal from an environmental NGO perspective, and I think that should really change. But what can the average citizen do about that? Well, let these organizations know that geothermal is really cool and that they need to get up to speed about it, right? And they need to be thinking about strategy, and they need to be thinking about making some public statements about it. And in terms of average citizen philanthropy and what you fund, I would say put your money toward the organizations that are leading, right? So in turn, when organizations come out and they start pushing, like Clean Air Task Force, right, like Project InnerSpace, support, because that will cause an avalanche of interest, and you start building a snowball in that situation where other organizations, quite frankly, after I launched Project InnerSpace, I had a bunch of environmental NGOs reach out and say, hey, should we be thinking about this? We don't know anything about it. And it's those types of that's a real opportunity to get things moving in organizations that are not on board yet. So, I would to the whole audience of Pivot, I would say, let's do it. Go, y'all, start calling people. You just got to be annoying for a year, and then you'll get some traction.
And Drew, I saw you raised your hand. I actually wanted to turn to you next for that, but also, so even within climate, there's only a handful of organizations looking at geothermal. We've seen this a number of ways in this panel so far. How do you bridge the gap and bring more nonprofits or philanthropists into the fold?
Yeah, that's a good question, but I just want to rewind slightly, if I could. The issue that Jamie raised is a real one, and it's a real risk as well. I think those of us that have been involved in the climate space for a while have seen various technologies kind of rise to the surface as the next big climate savior. And then people go, oh, wait, maybe this isn't a good idea. I mean, you look at what happened with biofuels, you look at what happened with carbon capture, you look at what's potentially happening with hydrogen, and, you know, potentially could happen with, if we are in the position where geothermal really starts to take off. I think we need to be thinking now about how do we get ahead of environmental concerns and make sure that those are addressed now to build comfort, have the environmental stakeholders at the table so that any regulations, any policies that are implemented have environmental protections built in from the start. And I think that's going to be critical. But no environmental group at this point is staffed to do that. And so it's very much a chicken and an egg sort of problem. And I don't have a good answer other than a number of philanthropic organizations getting together and saying, okay, we're going to fund groups A, B, and C to build geothermal programs. But that's a lot easier said than done. And I think there is also a risk, you know, the word fracking is seen as a negative word in many quarters. And for those technologies that are used hydraulic fracturing for geothermal, there will be a concern from environmental groups. So how do you get ahead of that? And then, but there's also the other side of this, which is wind and solar are very land intensive. And there is an environmental cost associated with that. I think that environmental cost does not outweigh the benefits, and we should still be going full bore on renewables. But the footprint for geothermal is significantly smaller. And you can also put geothermal a lot closer to urban loads, potentially, than when wind and solar can. And so you need a lot less transmission. And so there are environmental benefits like that people need to be thinking about quantifying, doing the sorts of studies that I mentioned earlier, to help get that into the public sphere so people recognize some of those benefits.
Drew, you've read one of our audience members' minds who asked, you know, how do folks feel about working with oil and gas? And you started to answer that question already. So I wanted to open that question up to the rest of the panel. How do your organizations feel about working with the oil and gas industry, and how do you think that is perceived more broadly at this point?
I can kick that one off, actually. I'm finding it so hard that I had to start a nonprofit to be a neutral. I didn't start off thinking I needed to do a separate organization. I started off thinking I could just make connections. But climate philanthropy, climate activists, and oil and gas entities don't currently mix. And Pivot is a platform where everybody shows up, and the demographic is awesome. I mean, we've got an environmental panel later today. Yesterday, it was all oil and gas. I mean, we're all here, but we're not at the same table, and we're not talking to one another. We're at the same platform, but that's as close as we've gotten so far. And I think, the reason InnerSpace exists is because, I'm this neutral entity, this entity that has all of these stakeholders around it. I think the goal would be to connect everyone directly, right? But in my view, we are not yet. And I think that there's a lot of concern about reputational risk. And I mean, honestly, quite frankly, from an environmental organization standpoint, they sue the entities that are sponsoring this conference. I mean, if you just look at the reality of the relationships, they are tensioned, they are adversarial, but geothermal is this neutral, awesome thing that everybody likes, maybe for different reasons, and we're using different terminology, but everybody likes it. And so I think the real challenge is going to be exactly that. Like, how do we put everything aside, come together, and but there's no clear solution to that right now, with the exception of finding a neutral place for everyone to meet. I'd love to hear the rest of the panel's perspective on this one. It's a really hard question.
Mm-hmm. Any other perspectives on this question? If not, I want to turn back to Tom. I saw you had your hand raised earlier.
Yeah, I wanted to answer your previous question, which is how do you get philanthropy to do more? And I think one critical piece of this is agenda setting. That is to say, what are the philanthropic opportunities that have a high social return in the sense that they could be catalytic in terms of the growth of geothermal, but there's some reason why the private sector is not going to invest in it. So, one of the things that we've been supporting Jamie and Project InnerSpace to work on is this question of what would a open data set that would help enable resource characterization for geothermal. Obviously, if you went to a venture capitalist and said, I want you to fund me to collect a lot of data, and then we're going to put it in the public domain, the venture capitalist is going to say, well, why would I do that? What's your monetization strategy? How am I going to get my 10x return? Mm-hmm. So, philanthropists ultimately have to be able to answer the what, the how, the who, and the why type of questions. Who am I going to write a check to? How much does that check need to be? If the project were successful, what are the short and medium and longer term outputs and outcomes that are associated with it? Why do I think it's plausible that this investment could lead to this outcome? Why won't the private sector do it? So you have to put yourself in the shoes of the philanthropist and say, what is philanthropy in a unique position to do? Mm-hmm. And more broadly, wealthy families have at least 4 different tools that are worth thinking about. One is the one that we've been talking about, which is philanthropy, that is making grants and gifts. The second is investing, but maybe more with an impact lens, the type of work that you've done, Michael, where you're looking at the social return, not just the private return. The third is coalition building. So a lot of them have some convening power. They have the ability to bring together multiple sectors to work together. And the fourth is advocacy. So if there's something that really requires policy change, obviously they have the ability to support that as well. So thinking not just about foundations, but individual philanthropists who have these 4 tools that they can bring to bear to solve a particular problem, and asking yourself, what would you do if you were in that situation?
Mm-hmm. Tom, you bring up some great points. And I think it speaks to a larger picture that we're painting, which is this is a pretty complex and nuanced world. It can be hard to figure out where the best use of an incremental dollar is. And so I wanted to take that and fold in 2 audience questions that are best exemplified by one particular case. So, somebody in the audience has asked, about, a friend of theirs, they're a philanthropist with $1 billion wealth, gets geothermal, is interested in it, but finds the necessary due diligence and other processes potentially a bit onerous, just hard to navigate. So for folks like that, how would you all recommend they actually get their money to work? Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so I think there's an important role for identifying people who have a broad view of the industry and understand what the leverage points are. And so, Michael, not to put you on the spot, but I think it would be very useful for you to explain what you had to do as an ARPA-E fellow, or what your colleagues as ARPA-E program managers had to do. Did you have to answer the Heilmeier Catechism?
Yeah, so I can give I'll break the moderator fourth wall and answer the question.
Yeah, so but the same skills that are necessary to be a good ARPA-E or DARPA program manager, I think, could also inform how a philanthropist thinks about investing their philanthropic capital.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, yeah, in my experience, I came into ARPA-E not really even knowing what the word geothermal meant. And so it was really an exercise of building from the ground up. I noticed that once, I learned what it meant and got interested in it, it was an exercise in talking to a lot of people. And one of the great things that I discovered pretty early on in the geothermal world was that people were excited to talk to a funder. It was this field that hadn't gotten a lot of love outside of the DOE geothermal office, and we're just excited that somebody else had taken an interest. And so through that process, and then a bit of intuition developing about what goals would be important to reach, we were able in a team of a couple of us to craft a couple of proposals, get funds out the door through a couple of different funding opportunities that were both opportunistic and intentionally created. And all in all, I was spending maybe half my time on this at ARPA-E, and it took on the order of 6 to 9 months to get to a place where we felt pretty comfortable. But the journey is going to be different for everybody. That's what I went through. So I wanted, since we just have a couple of minutes left, I wanted to open up the panel for final comments, final thoughts that we haven't gotten a chance to speak of otherwise. And I think let's go in reverse order of what we did at the top. So let's start with Marc, then Drew, then Jamie, and then wrap with Tom. If you could each take about a minute to give any final thoughts that we haven't gotten a chance to say, but would be important to get across.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. And really, I think, very exciting conversation. What I wanted to putting my neglected climate opportunities head on, one of the things that I think we haven't really talked about very much is the opportunity for geothermal for heat and for basically heating and cooling. And I think see a lot of complementarity there. I actually personally think we might be paying too much attention to electricity and not enough to the heat opportunity. Looking also at geographies beyond just the US, you look at Europe and what's happening there, and the people worried about freezing in the winter with the gas situation. I think there's some really good opportunity that we should pay close attention to, and that might be actually more short-term than some of the electricity opportunity. The other part that I wanted to emphasize is really not to just look at, we shouldn't silo everything. It's like, I think the subsurface space is offering a lot of opportunity, as I said earlier, on potentially carbon sequestration. There's even the new emerging field of geologic hydrogen. And whenever you drill a well, see how you can get the best use of it. And the very first thing would be just to share samples. There's like, I know that the USGS in conjunction with Colorado School of Mine is desperately looking for samples to characterize the subsurface for potential hydrogen generation. It's like, look in your wells for hydrogen. And so let's build a large community of people that are looking at productive ways of utilizing the subsurface. But at the same time, also maybe going back to your question on the oil industry, I think it's a tremendous resource. And the oil industry is not just the oil companies, but it's all the people that have expertise, all the tremendous workforce that exists. And they can bring so much to accelerating the subsurface potential that I think we really need to find a good forum to work together and really push projects forward.
Over to Drew.
Yeah, those are great points, Marc. I'll add just two other quick ones. One is, should the infrastructure, the IRA pass, there will be a lot of money that goes to coal communities on renewables, and renewables projects in those communities will get an extra benefit. There's no reason why that couldn't be done with geothermal. And then following on to that, should it pass, who's in charge of making sure, and who's going to be pushing for, and who's organizing to make sure that geothermal continues to be part of these conversations and raises these sorts of opportunities, because I think that's going to be important in moving forward.
All right, I'm going to be super quick because I know we're running out of time. The one thing I'd say, I've been trying to figure out the right forum to say this, and I think this panel might be the forum. There are a lot of grassroots, and this is a shout out to the demographic of the Pivot audience, which is, was last year 60% oil and gas. And let's see this year, the trend is toward Texas, it's toward oil and gas. So for you all, if your entity is not moving on geothermal, and many people reach out and say they're frustrated about that. Well, in some of the oil and gas entities, you get a budget to make philanthropic donations, oil and gas money with money. Find a nonprofit that you like that's working on geothermal and donate that money to that nonprofit. There are things that you can do to help the ground movement in terms
or they
of
can join the TextGea, Jamie.
Or TextGea, right? Exactly. So, there are things that you can do internally in your entities, but also use your philanthropic dollars to support geothermal. Turn.
My call to action is I'm very interested in what the audience believes would be the equivalent of Operation Warp Speed or Frontier Climate or the NASA SpaceX collaboration or the X Prize or the DREAM set of offtake agreements or the equivalent of the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance or the First Movers Coalition for geothermal. And I think that if the industry and other subject matter experts came together and developed some concrete proposals in this area, I think that there's a good chance we could get them done.
All right, that's a great note to end on, and we'll have to leave it here. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. Thank you, audience members, for joining us and sending in great questions. That's it from us. Enjoy the rest of Pivot. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.
Bye-bye.